23rd August 1942. The Volga River. The sky above Stalingrad turned black at 4 in the afternoon, not from clouds, but from smoke, thick, choking columns of it that rose from 1,000 fires, ignited by the Luftwaffe's most relentless bombing campaign of the war. The air itself seemed to scream. Junkers U-87 Stukas dove in shrieking spirals, their sirens, designed specifically to terrorize, wailing like harbingers of apocalypse. Below them, the city of 500,000 souls burned. Wooden houses exploded into splinters, brick factories crumbled. The Barricadi gun factory, the Red October steel plant, the Dzerzhinsky tractor works, symbols of Soviet industrial might, became infernos. In the streets, civilians ran with nowhere to go. Some were vaporized instantly. Others, trapped beneath rubble, screamed until their voices gave out. By nightfall, over 40,000 people were dead, and this was only the beginning. Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from the Second World War. Where are you watching from, and what would you have done if your city became the front line of history's most brutal battle? The city bore the name of Joseph Stalin himself, Stalingrad. To lose it was unthinkable. To defend it would require something beyond strategy, beyond courage. It would require the willingness to turn every street, every building, every pile of rubble into a grave for the enemy. By the time the battle ended 5 months later, Stalingrad would become a symbol, not just of Soviet resistance, but of the limits of human endurance, the depths of human cruelty, and the terrible cost of ideology wrapped in steel and fire. But in August 1942, none of that was certain. What was certain was this: Adolf Hitler wanted Stalingrad, and he was willing to destroy the entire Sixth Army to get it. The question that haunted the ruins, whispered among dying men in cellars and bunkers, was simple. Could any city, any army, any people survive what was coming? The answer would be written in blood across 5 months of winter, written in the ashes of a metropolis, written in the frozen corpses of 2 armies locked in a death embrace from which only one would emerge. The road to Stalingrad, Operation Blau. Hitler's obsession with Stalingrad was not born in a vacuum. It grew from desperation masked as ambition. By the summer of 1942, the Wehrmacht had failed to capture Moscow. The winter counteroffensive of 1941-42 had pushed German forces back from the Soviet capital, shattering the illusion of invincibility. The Soviet Union, bloodied but unbroken, still stood. And worse, for Hitler and his generals, it was growing stronger. Factories evacuated beyond the Ural Mountains were producing tanks, aircraft, and artillery at rates that exceeded German intelligence estimates. The window for victory was closing. Germany's war machine, for all its blitzkrieg brilliance, was running on fumes, literally. Oil, that was the prize. The Caucasus oil fields near Baku produced over 70% of the Soviet Union's fuel. Maikop, Grozny, Baku, these names represented not just petroleum deposits, but the lifeblood of modern warfare. If Germany could seize them, the Red Army's tanks would stop rolling, the Soviet Air Force would be grounded, the entire war effort would collapse like a house of cards. Operation Blau, Case Blue, was launched on June 28, 1942. Army Group South, commanded initially by Field Marshal Fyodor von Bock, smashed through Soviet lines in southern Russia with overwhelming force. Panzer divisions raced across the steppes, their tracks churning through wheat fields that stretched to the horizon. Towns fell like dominoes: Voronezh, Rostov, Voroshilovgrad, each a pin on Hitler's map, each a step closer to the oil. By late July, German forces had reached the Don River, a natural barrier that snaked through the southern Russian landscape. Victory seemed not just possible, but inevitable. But Hitler, as he so often did, allowed hubris to override strategy. On 23 July, he issued Führer Directive No. 45, a document that would seal the fate of hundreds of thousands of men. He split his forces. Army Group South was divided into Army Group A, tasked with driving south into the Caucasus Mountains toward the oil fields, and Army Group B, ordered to secure the flank along the Volga River and cut Soviet supply lines. At the center of that flank sat Stalingrad, a sprawling industrial city stretching 30 miles along the western bank of the Volga, a vital transportation hub where the river met the railway lines connecting the Caucasus to central Russia. Originally, Stalingrad was a secondary objective, a city to be isolated and bypassed, but Hitler's ego intervened. The city bore Stalin's name. To capture it would be a propaganda triumph of the highest order, a humiliation of the Soviet dictator that would resonate across the world. Orders were given: take Stalingrad, at any cost. The mission was clear, the timeline aggressive. Few German commanders questioned it openly. After all, they had conquered most of Europe. What was one Soviet city? The man chosen to execute this order was General Friedrich Paulus, commander of the 6th Army, one of the most powerful formations in the Wehrmacht, hardened by 2 years of conquest across Poland, France, and deep into Russia. Paulus was 52 years old, tall, aristocratic in bearing, with the meticulous mind of a staff officer. He was methodical, disciplined, a man more comfortable with maps and logistics than mud and blood. He had never commanded an army in actual battle before his appointment. Now he was tasked with taking a city defended by a man who had absolutely no intention of giving it up. That man was General Vasily Choykov, and he was about to teach the Wehrmacht what urban warfare truly meant. The defender, Choykov and the 62nd Army. Vasily Ivanovich Choykov was 52 years old, the same age as his German counterpart, but the similarities ended there. Where Paulus was refined and cerebral, Choykov was crude and visceral. A peasant's son from a village near Moscow, he had clawed his way up through the Red Army ranks through a combination of raw competence, political savvy, and sheer bloody-mindedness. He was short, stocky, built like a barrel, and missing several teeth from a grenade blast years earlier. He had a temper that could blister paint and a vocabulary that made veteran soldiers blush. He also had something rare among Soviet commanders in 1942: combat experience, tactical flexibility, and a willingness to ignore suicidal orders from above if he thought he could win by disobeying them. On 12 September 1942, as German forces were already fighting in the suburbs of Stalingrad, Choykov was summoned to the headquarters of the Stalingrad Front, located in a bunker carved into the eastern bank of the Volga, several miles from the burning city. There he met 2 men who would shape his destiny: Nikita Khrushchev, the political commissar and future Soviet leader, and General Andrei Yeremenko, the front commander. The situation was catastrophic. The German 6th Army was already inside the city limits. Soviet defenders were being pushed back street by street, building by building. Morale was collapsing. Units were disintegrating. Officers were requesting permission to retreat across the Volga. The city was on the verge of falling. Yeremenko, a gruff commander with no patience for defeatism, fixed Choykov with a hard stare and asked a single direct question: "Comrade Choykov, can you hold Stalingrad?" Choykov didn't hesitate. His answer was immediate, delivered in his characteristic growl: "I will hold the city or die trying." It was not bravado, it was calculation. Choykov understood that retreat was not an option. Stalin had issued Order 227, not one step back, which authorized blocking detachments to shoot deserters and cowards. But more than that, Choykov believed he could win, not through conventional tactics, but by turning the city itself into a weapon, by negating every German advantage and forcing them to fight on his terms. He was given command of the 62nd Army, what was left of it, fewer than 50,000 men, most of them exhausted, shell-shocked, and poorly equipped. Many were fresh recruits who had barely fired a rifle. Others were survivors of earlier battles, their units shattered, their officers dead. They had no tanks, little artillery, and almost no air support. What they did have was the Volga at their backs and a commander who refused to accept defeat. Choykov crossed the Volga that very night, 12th September, under heavy German artillery fire. Shells exploded in the water around his boat, sending up geysers of spray. He reached the western bank and climbed the smoking rubble to establish his headquarters in a series of bunkers and tunnels carved into the cliffs overlooking the river.
From there, he could see the entire city, or what was left of it. Fires burned everywhere, buildings collapsed in clouds of dust. The sound of gunfire was constant, a crackling symphony of death. Choikov understood something his German counterpart did not, something that would define the entire battle. In Stalingrad, conventional tactics were worse than useless. They were suicidal. The Germans excelled at combined arms warfare, tanks, infantry, artillery, and air support working in seamless concert across open terrain. They had perfected this in Poland, France, and the early campaigns in Russia. But in a city reduced to rubble, where every building was...
Chuikov adopted a brutal new doctrine that he summarized in 3 words: hug the enemy. Soviet soldiers were ordered to stay as close to German lines as physically possible, sometimes within 50 meters, sometimes within grenade-throwing distance, sometimes sharing the same ruined building on different floors. This doctrine had a simple, devastating logic. It nullified the Luftwaffe's air superiority. German bombers and Stukas couldn't strike Soviet positions without hitting their own troops. German artillery had to be cautious for the same reason. The battle devolved into savage, intimate violence. Knives, grenades, entrenching tools, bare hands. Chuikov also implemented the concept of active defense. There would be no passive holding of lines, no waiting for the German assault. Every building, every floor, every room, every stairwell would be contested with maximum aggression. If the Germans took a factory in the morning, the Soviets would counterattack at dusk and retake it. If a position became untenable, defenders would fall back to the next ruined building and turn it into a fortress. The city became a meat grinder, and Chuikov fed it willingly, trading space for time, knowing that every day Stalingrad held was another day the Red Army High Command had to prepare its massive counteroffensive. But first, his men had to survive, and survival in Stalingrad was measured in hours, not days. The battle for the city, September Hell. By mid-September, the 6th Army had penetrated deep into Stalingrad, pushing Soviet defenders back toward the Volga in a grinding, relentless offensive. German soldiers, many of them veterans of France, Poland, and the early Russian campaigns, men who had seen combat from the Atlantic to Moscow, were stunned by what they encountered in this city on the Volga. This was not war as they knew it. This was something different, something primal and horrifying. Buildings were hollow shells, their walls pockmarked by thousands of bullets and shell fragments. Floors collapsed into basements, creating vertical mazes, staircases ending in midair. Snipers lurked in the shadows, patient and invisible, capable of putting a bullet through a man's eye from 300 meters. Booby traps turned every doorway, every piece of furniture, every corpse into a potential death sentence. Soviet soldiers fought with a ferocity that bordered on the suicidal, a fanaticism born not of ideology, but of desperation. They knew that behind them was the Volga, and behind the Volga was nothing but the endless steppe. There was nowhere to retreat. One German officer, a lieutenant in the 24th Panzer Division, later wrote in his diary words that would be published after the war: "We have fought for 15 days for a single house. The front is a corridor between burnt-out rooms. It is the length of a corridor between 2 burnt-out windows. From story to story, faces black with sweat, we bombard each other with grenades in the middle of explosions, clouds of dust and smoke, heaps of mortar, floods of blood, fragments of furniture and human beings. The city is no longer a town. By day, it is an enormous cloud of burning, blinding smoke. It is a vast furnace lit by the reflection of the flames. And when night arrives, one of those scorching, howling, bleeding nights, the dogs plunge into the Volga and swim desperately to gain the other bank. The nights of Stalingrad are a terror for them. Animals flee this hell. The hardest stones cannot bear it for long. Only men endure." The fighting was apocalyptic in scale and intimacy. German combat engineers used flamethrowers to clear bunkers, spraying liquid fire into basements where Soviet defenders huddled. Soviet soldiers responded by hurling Molotov cocktails from upper floors, bottles filled with gasoline, kerosene, and sulfuric acid that turned men into human torches.
Hand-to-hand combat was not occasional, it was routine. Soldiers strangled each other in stairwells, bayonets and entrenching tools became primary weapons. Men fought with stones, with broken bottles, with their bare hands. The average life expectancy of a Soviet soldier newly arrived in Stalingrad was 24 hours. For junior officers, it was 3 days. One of the most savage battles took place at Mamayev Kurgan, a hill in the center of the city that rose 102 meters from the surrounding terrain. From its summit, observers could direct artillery fire across the entire city. Whoever controlled Mamayev Kurgan controlled Stalingrad. It changed hands multiple times in September and October, sometimes daily. The hill was subjected to such intense bombardment that the soil was literally churned over, mixed with metal fragments from shells, bullets.
Chukov's headquarters was nearly overrun twice in September. On one terrifying occasion, German infantry advanced to within 300 meters of his command bunker. Staff officers grabbed rifles and submachine guns and manned the perimeter. Chukov himself, never one to lead from the rear, seized a PPSH-41 submachine gun and joined the defense, firing from a slit trench at shadowy figures moving through the smoke. For 2 hours, the outcome hung in the balance. Then a Soviet reserve battalion rushed across the Volga in open boats despite artillery fire, counterattacked, and drove the Germans back. Chukov's headquarters held. Barely. But the pressure was unbearable. By the end of September, the 62nd Army controlled only a narrow strip of land along the Volga, no more than a few hundred meters deep in most places, sometimes as little as 50 meters. Soviet soldiers could hear the river lapping against the shore behind them. In front, the Germans pressed forward relentlessly. The Soviets clung to the riverbank like drowning men to driftwood, their fingernails breaking, their strength failing. And still, impossibly, they did not break. They held. Hour by hour, day by day, they held. Pavlov's house, the fortress that defied an army. Amid the chaos and carnage of September, one location became legendary, a symbol of Soviet resistance that would be taught in military academies for generations. A 4-story apartment building on Seleknaya Street, near the city center, overlooking the January 9th Square. It was defended by Sergeant Yakov Pavlov and a platoon of fewer than 30 men. Russians, Ukrainians, Georgians, Uzbeks, a microcosm of the Soviet Union huddled in the ruins of one building. On 27th September, Pavlov's reconnaissance unit seized the building from a German detachment in a swift nighttime assault. What they found was a wreck, walls holed by artillery, windows blown out, but the structure sound. Pavlov, a stocky sergeant from Novgorod with a talent for improvisation, immediately recognized its tactical value. The building dominated the square and provided clear fields of fire in 3 directions. He radioed Chukov's headquarters. "We're staying." Over the next 48 hours, Pavlov's men transformed the apartment building into a fortress. They barricaded windows with bricks and furniture, leaving only narrow firing slits. They punched holes through interior walls to create hidden firing positions and escape routes. They laid mines around the perimeter and strung barbed wire across approaches. The basement became a command post and shelter. The roof became a sniper's nest and observation post. A communications trench, dug by engineers under cover of darkness, connected Pavlov's house to Soviet lines along the Volga, allowing resupply and reinforcement. For 58 days, Pavlov's house held against everything the Wehrmacht could throw at it. German infantry assaulted it repeatedly, sometimes twice a day, sometimes at night, sometimes with flamethrower teams leading the charge. Panzers rolled up to the building and fired point-blank into the walls, their 75mm shells punching through brick but failing to dislodge the defenders. Stukas dropped bombs, blasting craters around the building, collapsing one corner, but the Soviets simply shifted to other rooms. The building was reduced to a skeleton of brick and rebar, barely recognizable as human habitation, yet the Pavlov's men refused to surrender. They received supplies and reinforcements through the communication trench, ammunition crates dragged through mud, fresh soldiers sent to replace the wounded and dead, water and bread when available. Soviet artillery, coordinated by a forward observer on Pavlov's roof, devastated German attack formations before they could close in. Anti-tank rifles positioned in the basement knocked out several German armored vehicles at close range. Machine gun nests covered every approach. German soldiers began to call the building the fortress and avoided it when possible. Chukov, in his memoirs written years later, remarked that the Germans lost more men trying to take Pavlov's house than they did taking Paris. While this was likely propaganda, an exaggeration designed to boost morale and highlight German incompetence, it captured a deeper truth. In Stalingrad, every inch of ground, every pile of rubble, every broken building was bought with blood, and the defenders made the Germans pay in full. Pavlov survived the war. He was awarded the title Hero of the Soviet Union. The building still stands today in Volgograd, restored and preserved as a memorial, its walls marked with commemorative plaques listing the names of the defenders. The factories, cauldrons of fire. By October, as autumn rains turned the rubble into a quagmire,
Soviet workers who had built T-34 tanks and 76mm field guns now fought alongside soldiers to defend the factories. Workshops became bunkers, their thick concrete walls resistant to all but the heaviest shells. Assembly lines became trenches, blast furnaces, some still radiating heat from their last loads of molten steel, provided cover and warmth in the freezing nights. Overhead cranes and gantries offered sniper positions. The factories were defenders' dreams and attackers' nightmares, three-dimensional labyrinths where orienteering was impossible and ambush was inevitable. The Germans threw everything at the factories. Paulus committed his operational reserves, gambling that one final push would break Soviet resistance. Entire divisions were ground down to company strength in the meat grinder of the factory district. The 24th Panzer Division, once a proud formation of over 15,000 men and hundreds of tanks that had spearheaded the drive across the Don, was reduced within weeks to a few dozen operational tanks and a couple thousand infantry. The 389th Infantry Division lost 75% of its strength. The 100th Jaeger Division was annihilated. Soldiers fought room to room, machine to machine, in conditions that defied description. In the Red October steel plant, German and Soviet soldiers occupied different floors of the same building, separated only by ceilings that shook continuously with grenades, automatic fire, and the thud of collapsing walls. One Soviet lieutenant, Anatoly Mereshko, a staff officer who survived to write his memoirs, later recalled with haunting clarity, "We fought in the foundry. There were still vats of molten metal from before the evacuation. Men fell into them during the fighting, pushed, stumbling in the darkness, or blown backward by explosions. The screams. You never forget the screams. They ended quickly, at least. The smell lingered for days." The fighting was so close, so intimate, that artillery became useless. Forward observers couldn't distinguish friend from foe in the smoke and chaos. Mortars and grenades were the weapons of choice. Soviet reinforcements crossed the Volga at night, loaded onto barges and boats, and were thrown immediately into combat upon landing. Many died within hours, sometimes within minutes, before they even learned the names of their comrades. Yet the line held, barely, by centimeters, but it held. German soldiers, exhausted and traumatized, began to question whether Stalingrad could be taken at all. Letters home, later intercepted by Soviet intelligence, spoke of despair, of fighting an enemy who wouldn't die, of a city that devoured men and gave nothing back. One soldier wrote, "Stalingrad is hell on earth. We advance 30 meters and lose a company. We take a building at dawn and lose it by dusk. The Russians are not human. They fight from the rubble like ghosts." But while the Wehrmacht bled itself white in the factories of Stalingrad, grinding forward meter by bloody meter, hundreds of miles away in Moscow, in a secure command bunker deep beneath the Kremlin, Marshal Georgy Konstantinovich Zhukov, Stalin's most trusted general and the architect of the Moscow counteroffensive, was planning something audacious, something that would change everything. A trap, a great encirclement, an operation that would destroy the Sixth Army and its supporting units. The operation was codenamed Uranus, after the ancient Greek god of the sky, and it was audacious in scale and conception. Zhukov's plan was simple in outline, but staggeringly complex in execution. Two Soviet fronts, the Southwestern Front under General Nikolai Vatutin and the Stalingrad Front under General Yeremenko, would strike simultaneously at the flanks of Army Group B, the German formation stretching along the Don River northwest and south of Stalingrad. These flanks were held not by crack German divisions, but by poorly equipped, under-strength Romanian, Hungarian, and Italian units, Hitler's allies, pressed into service to free German troops for the assault on the city. These Allied divisions were spread thin across hundreds of miles of front, undersupplied, underarmed, and increasingly demoralized. If the Soviets could break through on both flanks, they would meet somewhere west of Stalingrad, behind Pallas's army, trapping it in a massive pocket with its back to the Volga. Stalin approved the plan in mid-October. Secrecy was absolute. Reserves were amassed in complete silence under cover of night and camouflage. Over 1 million Soviet troops, organized into fresh divisions pulled from the Far East and Siberia, were positioned along the Don. With them came 13,000.
The date was set, 19th November, 1942. The weather turned. Snow began to fall across the southern Russian steppe. Temperatures dropped and fog rolled in from the Volga, conditions that would ground the Luftwaffe and blind German reconnaissance. Perfect conditions for a surprise attack. On 19th November, at precisely 7:30 a.m., the Soviet artillery opened fire. The barrage was apocalyptic in scale, thousands of guns firing simultaneously along a 250-mile front from positions carefully registered over the previous days. Romanian positions disintegrated under the onslaught, bunkers collapsed, communication trenches filled with corpses. Command posts were obliterated, panic spread like wildfire. Within minutes, entire regiments ceased to exist as coherent fighting units. Soviet tanks poured through the gaps, engines roaring, commanders standing in open turrets, waving their units forward. Resistance crumbled. By nightfall, the Southwestern Front had advanced over 50 miles into the German rear, smashing through the Romanian Third Army and threatening the airfields that supplied Paulus's forces. The next day, 20th November, the Soviet front attacked from the south of the city. Again, Romanian defenses, this time the Fourth Army, collapsed almost immediately. Soviet tank columns raced westward, bypassing pockets of resistance, driving deep into the German rear like spears, severing communication lines, overrunning supply depots, spreading chaos. German units rushed to plug the gaps, found themselves outflanked and surrounded. On 22nd November, the two Soviet pincers met near the town of Kalach on the Don, west of Stalingrad. Tank crews from the Southwestern and Stalingrad fronts embraced, fired flares into the sky, and radioed headquarters. The trap was closed. The Sixth Army, over 250,000 men, the pride of the Wehrmacht, was encircled in a pocket roughly 30 miles wide and 20 miles deep, surrounded by Soviet armies that now numbered over 1 million troops. Paulus was stunned. For 24 hours he refused to believe the reports. Then, as the full scope of the disaster became clear, he radioed Hitler's headquarters with an urgent request: permission to break out westward while there was still time, before the Soviet ring solidified. The Sixth Army had perhaps 48 hours before encirclement became permanent. If they moved immediately, abandoning heavy equipment and fighting their way through Soviet lines, they might escape. Hitler's response was unequivocal: no. Stalingrad would be held. The Sixth Army would stand fast. Relief would come. Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe and Hitler's designated successor, made a fateful promise.
He could supply the pocket by air, delivering 500 tons of supplies per day, the minimum required to keep the army operational. It was a fantasy, a grotesque miscalculation born of Goering's ego and his desire to restore the Luftwaffe's reputation after failures in the Battle of Britain. The Luftwaffe had never successfully supplied a pocket of this size. Winter weather, Soviet air defenses, the distances involved, the number of transport aircraft available, all made the task impossible. But Hitler believed him. Or perhaps Hitler simply couldn't accept the alternative, couldn't admit that his greatest army was doomed. On 24th November, he ordered Paulus to establish a defensive hedgehog and wait for relief. Paulus, the obedient staff officer, complied. The Sixth Army dug in, and the slow death began. Winter, the death of the Sixth Army. December brought the Russian winter in its full, terrible majesty. Temperatures plummeted to -30, -40 degrees Celsius. Snow fell continuously, covering the steppe in a white shroud, drifting against ruined buildings and burned-out tanks. German soldiers who had been told they would be home by Christmas, who had not been issued winter uniforms because the High Command expected the war to be over before winter, froze in their positions. Thin overcoats and summer uniforms offered no protection against the Siberian wind. Frostbite became epidemic. Men lost fingers, toes, ears, noses to the cold. Trenchfoot rotted legs from within. Every night, hundreds froze to death at their posts. Food ran out. The Luftwaffe never delivered more than a fraction of the promised supplies. On the best days, perhaps 100 tons, but usually far less. Entire days passed when no aircraft reached the pocket due to weather or Soviet fighters. Horses were slaughtered for meat, their frozen carcasses hacked apart with axes. Soldiers hunted rats in the ruins. Soup kitchens watered down rations until men were receiving barely 200 calories per day. Starvation became the Sixth Army's constant companion. Wounded men died not from their injuries but from lack of food, their bodies too weak to heal. Medical supplies vanished. Morphine ran out. Surgeons performed amputations without anesthesia, holding patients down while they screamed. Soviet forces tightened the noose methodically, launching probing attacks week after week, shrinking the pocket incrementally, destroying German strongpoints one by one. Airfields inside the pocket, Potomnik, Gumrock, Stalingradsky, came under artillery fire, making supply flights even more perilous. German transport aircraft, mainly lumbering Junkers U-52s, were shot down by Soviet fighters or anti-aircraft fire. Pilots flew missions knowing they had perhaps a 50-50 chance of returning. Many didn't. Inside Stalingrad itself, fighting continued as the Sixth Army starved. German soldiers, gaunt and hollow-eyed, defended their positions with the desperation of men who knew they were forgotten. The Soviets pressed forward, sensing victory. On January 8, 1943, after weeks of preparation, the Red Army offered surrender terms. Lay down your arms and you will be treated according to the Geneva Convention, given food and medical care. Paulus, still under orders from Hitler, refused. The offer was rejected. The Red Army attacked. Operation Ring, the final assault on the pocket, began on January 10, 1943, with an artillery barrage that lasted 3 hours and consumed over 1 million shells. Soviet infantry advanced behind walls of fire, supported by tanks, overwhelming exhausted German defenders who had nothing left to give. The pocket shrank day by day. Potomnik.
By the end of January, the pocket was split in two. German soldiers huddled in cellars and bunkers, burning furniture for warmth, eating anything, leather belts, boot soles, wallpaper paste. Some resorted to cannibalism, though this was rare and spoken of only in whispers. Suicides increased. Officers shot themselves rather than face Soviet captivity. On 30th January, the 10th anniversary of Hitler's rise to power, Hitler promoted Paulus to field marshal in a cynical, calculated gesture. No German field marshal had ever surrendered. It was an implicit order: die in the ruins or take your own life. Paulus, broken in body and spirit, refused to kill himself.
On 31st January, Soviet troops stormed his headquarters in the basement of the Univermag department store. Paulus surrendered, along with his staff. The southern pocket ceased to exist. The northern pocket, isolated and leaderless, held out for 2 more days in a final spasm of resistance before collapsing on 2nd February 1943. The Battle of Stalingrad was over. The cost: a city of ghosts. The statistics are almost incomprehensible. Of the 250,000 men encircled in November, only 90,000 survived to be taken prisoner in February. Tens of thousands had been killed in the fighting. The rest died of starvation, disease, and cold. Of those 90,000 prisoners, barely 6,000 would ever return to Germany. The rest perished in Soviet prisoner of war camps, succumbing to typhus, dysentery, malnutrition, and the after effects of frostbite and trauma. The Sixth Army, the spearhead of Hitler's ambitions in the East, ceased to exist as a military formation. It would never be reconstituted. Soviet losses were equally staggering. The Red Army suffered over 1.1 million casualties, killed, wounded, and missing during the 5 months of battle. Choikov's 62nd Army alone was reinforced and rebuilt multiple times, fed continuously with fresh divisions that were consumed in the furnace of the city. Civilian casualties remain unknown, but are estimated at over 40,000 killed in the initial bombing alone, with thousands more dying during the subsequent months of fighting and starvation. Stalingrad itself was unrecognizable. 99% of the city's buildings were destroyed or damaged beyond repair. Aerial photographs showed a landscape that resembled the surface of the moon. Craters, rubble, skeletal walls, nothing else. The population, once 500,000, was reduced to a few thousand traumatized survivors hiding in cellars and sewers, emerging slowly into the ruins like ghosts. It would take years to clear the rubble, decades to rebuild. In total, an estimated 2 million people, soldiers and civilians, Soviet and German, Romanian, Italian, Hungarian, died in and around Stalingrad between August 1942 and February 1943. The battle consumed more lives than the United States lost in the entire Second World War. It was the deadliest battle in human history, a wound cut so deep into the flesh of 2 nations that it has never fully healed. But the impact of Stalingrad was not merely numerical. It was psychological, strategic, and symbolic. Stalingrad shattered the myth of German invincibility that had dominated Europe since 1939. It was the first time an entire German army, not a regiment, not a division, but an entire army had been destroyed. Across occupied Europe, from France to Poland, resistance movements took heart. Partisans intensified their operations. Collaborators began to hedge their bets. In Germany itself, morale plummeted. Goebbels declared 3 days of national mourning. Theaters and cinemas closed. The German public, fed years of propaganda about inevitable victory, began for the first time to doubt. Whispers of defeat spread. For the Soviet Union, Stalingrad became a symbol, not just of resistance, but of transformation. The Red Army that emerged from the ruins was not the broken, retreating force of 1941 that had been driven back across thousands of miles. It was hardened, confident, experienced, and equipped with lessons learned in blood. Soviet commanders had discovered how to fight the Wehrmacht and win. Soviet industry, evacuated beyond the Urals, was now outproducing Germany in tanks, aircraft, and artillery. The tide of the war had turned. From Stalingrad, the Red Army would advance westward in an unstoppable wave, driving the Wehrmacht back across Ukraine, Belarus, and Poland, and ultimately into the heart of Germany itself. Legacy: the city that refused to die. The men who fought at Stalingrad carried its scars forever. Choikov survived, his reputation secured. He went on to command Soviet forces in the drive across Eastern Europe, personally accepting the surrender of Berlin in May 1945. He died in 1982, his ashes interred at Mamayev Kurgan, overlooking the city he had defended. Zhukov became the most decorated commander in Soviet history, his face synonymous with victory, though he would later fall victim to Stalin's paranoia and be sidelined before rehabilitation after Stalin's death.
Paulus, broken and disillusioned, became a prisoner of war. In Soviet captivity, he underwent a transformation, repudiating Nazism and eventually testifying against Nazi war crimes at the Nuremberg trials. He was released in 1953 and lived out his remaining years in East Germany, a ghost haunted by the frozen corpses of Stalingrad. He died in 1957. The city itself was rebuilt, rising slowly from the ashes like a phoenix. In 1961, during Khrushchev's de-Stalinization campaign, it was renamed Volgograd, though many Russians still call it Stalingrad. Today, it is a modern city of over 1 million people, its broad avenues and parks giving little indication of the hell that once consumed it. But the memory remains. The Mamayev-Kurgan Memorial Complex, inaugurated in 1967, stands on the hill where so many died. At its center rises a towering statue, The Motherland Calls, depicting a woman raising a sword to the sky, her face turned west toward the enemy, her mouth open in a cry of defiance. She's 85 meters tall, one of the tallest statues in the world. Her face is eternal. She does not forget. Stalingrad was more than a battle. It was a testament to human endurance, to the refusal to surrender in the face of annihilation, to the resilience of the human spirit when pushed beyond all conceivable limits. It was a city that should have died 100 times over, that by all logic should have fallen in September and October and November, but it did not. It endured. And in enduring, it changed the course of history, proving that even the mightiest military machine could be broken, that tyranny was not invincible, that ordinary people, workers, soldiers, civilians, could stand against the darkness and prevail. The ruins of Stalingrad still whisper their lessons to anyone willing to listen, that freedom has a price, that courage is not the absence of fear but action despite it, and that some things, honor, home, the future, are worth any sacrifice. But hundreds of miles to the west, on another front, a different kind of battle was brewing, one that would open a second front and bring the war home to Hitler's fortress Europe. Join us next time as we stand on the cliffs of Normandy and witness the dawn of D-Day, when thousands of young men stormed the beaches to liberate a continent. Until then, remember those who fought, and never forget the city that refused to die.